Hello, in this video we are going to complete the third step in this program that's going to be a simple console-based volume of cylinder calculator. And in this video we are going to look at a couple things. We're going to look at how to construct some basic while loops. We're going to look at initialization of variables. We're going to look at a simple if-else structure. And we're going to talk a little bit about Boolean operators. And these things are all going to allow us to satisfy some specifications that our user requested with this program. So where we left off in step 2 is that we could run through the program once, and provided we entered correct values, the volume would be calculated. However, to do a second calculation, we had to run the program again, and I could enter invalid values and get results that didn't make sense. For example, a negative volume. So what we've done here is we've made a really simple flowchart to kind of understand the process of what we want to happen. It's really good to get comfortable writing simple flowcharts. I'm not a big fan of following some real detailed system, but taking time to map out the flow of your logic off the computer is really helpful, especially as you get into more complicated problems. So the specifications say we take the input for the name once, so we're going to take the input for the name, and we're going to initialize the radius and height to 1, and you'll see why we'll do this shortly. And then we have this called a while loop. A while loop is a structure that will continue as long as something is true. So provided that radius is not equal to 0, or height is not equal to 0, that it means I have a value for radius or height that isn't 0, we're going to run through this section of code here. And so if that's true, we're going to take an input for radius and height. And then once we've taken the input for radius and height, we're going to check if radius is greater than 0, and height is greater than or equal to 0. Because only if they're both greater than or equal to 0 are we going to process or calculate the volume and then output the volume as the message. If either of these is less than 0, we're going to output an error message. And then we're going to come back to check that radius or height again, because the user said that if the user enters, if the program should basically exit if radius and height are both 0. And so if radius and height get re-entered as 0, then the program exits. Okay, so let's dive in. So the first thing we're going to do here is I'm going to set up what's called a while structure. So a while structure essentially looks like this. I write the word while, and then I put a Boolean expression inside there. For now, I'm just going to say while true, and I'm going to take all of this, and I'm going to tab all of that. This is what's called the while block. Everything inside of here is the while structure, meaning that if this Boolean expression evaluates to true, this will run. So let's take a second. Let's do one thing. Let's put one thing here outside the while block. Let's put a print end program. So let's save this, and now let's run our program and see what happens. So I'm going to say, let's just adjust this size so it fits properly on our screen. There we go. I'm going to say Python 3, and this one is called convol step 3. And so basically it runs up, and my name is Paul, and I put 4 and 5. And notice here I get hi Paul, it generates the outputs, and asks me for the radius again. So I say 5 and 6, and it generates a value, and I say 9 and 8, or 9 and 7, it does this again. Notice, it's continually asking me to input that value again. But it's never going to exit. And the reason why is that every time it reaches this while statement, it's true. So essentially what happens when it comes down here, it says while true, and that of course is true, so it enters the loop and runs to the bottom. And when we reach the end of the while block, what this does is this checks while condition again. Or let's say while Boolean expression. And of course true is true, so it comes back up to the top. So what we need to do here is we need to put some sort of statement in here that tells us when to loop. And we said that we're going to loop as long as radius is not equal to 0 or height is not equal to 0. Now let's save this and give this a run and see what happens. Oh, that's not where I want to go. So I'm going to have to break this out. So let's just enter a string. It's going to crash it. Okay, so now I run it. Ask me for my name, Paul, and I get an error. The reason I get an error here is because if we come back to our program again, When back into our program, this is the first time that radius appears and actually has a value. This is trying to check radius if it's not equal to 0. The problem is that radius hasn't been declared or initialized yet. So what I have to do here is I have to come up here and say radius. I'm going to set radius to 1. I'm going to set height to 1. And by doing this, what this does is it declares and initializes both of these values so that when I reach this while loop, it actually can inspect those values. And if we go back again to our flowchart that I quickly showed there it is. That's why I have to initialize radius and height before I actually reach the while loop. Because if the condition is going to check those, they have to exist. So now let's save this. Let's clear this. My name is Paul, and if I put 4, 5, it runs. I put 8, 9, it runs. And now watch, if I put 0, 0, and program. Because what happens is I put 0, 0, it reaches the bottom of this while block, and then it checks if radius is not equal to 0, or height is not equal to 0, which are both false, so the output is false, it exits. Well, we have one little issue now. Let's go back and run it again. Let's just observe an issue that we have that's come up. Come back here. Let's clear this. Paul. The problem right now is if I put -5 and 4, okay, so the radius is -5, it calculates that. And that works out to a positive because -5 just squares to positive 5. But if I put, say, 5, -4, I get a negative value for the volume, which doesn't make sense. So what we want to do is we want to use a conditional statement, 0, 0. We want to use a conditional statement to tell the program to only do this calculation right here if height and radius are both greater than or equal to 0. And to do that, we use something called an if-else structure. So the way an if-else structure works is we write the word if, and then we put a Boolean expression. And this is the true code block. So if this Boolean expression is true, it runs this code block. And we can put an else on there, meaning if it's false, it skips it and runs this code block. While statements and if statements are actually very similar. The only difference is that while loops will loop, meaning it can run a number of times, whereas an if statement will only ever run once. So if I come up here, actually let's take a look at this flowchart again. What I have here is I have if radius is greater than or equal to 0 and height is greater than or equal to 0. So I'm going to do this immediately after my input. And if it's true, I calculate the volume and output the volume. So let's go back to my code here. And so I'm going to do this right inside there. So I'm going to say if, and I'm going to say if radius is greater than or equal to 0 and height is greater than or equal to 0. And I'm going to take all of this, because that's the calculation and the rounding, and this is the actual message. Let's tab that out. So this here is the if code block. Pull that back, so the while loop. This is the if code block, and this only gets evaluated if this is true. So if the user puts in a value of, say, 4 and 5, 4 is greater than or equal to 0, and 5 is greater than or equal to 0, meaning that this will execute. So let's save this. Let's come down here. Let's run this. My name is Paul, and I'm going to put 4, 5, and sure enough, I get a value. But if I put -4, 3, notice nothing gets printed, because what happens is when I put in -4, 3 radius, this would evaluate here to false, and this would evaluate to true, but in AND statement, they both have to be true in order for the whole thing to be true. So therefore, it skips the if statement. But I wanted to actually give the user some feedback, so that's where I write else here. So I'm going to say else, and I'm just going to print a simple message, something like, and we put our escape codes in here so it looks nice. You have entered an invalid value. Now you could get quite a little more complicated with this, and you could actually give the user a little bit more detailed feedback, i.e. you have entered, a radius less than 0 or a height less than 0. But for now, we're just going to basically say you've entered an invalid value. Okay, so let's go back and let's give this a run. So let's go 0, 0 and exit. What is your name? Paul. And if I put in here -4, -5, you've entered an invalid value. -4, 3, you have entered an invalid value. 3, -4, you have entered an invalid value. So notice, using this conditional structure, I can actually now tell the program to do something different in certain situations. If I put 1, 9, I get a valid output. If I put 0, 0, the program exits. So just to summarize, in this video, we set the program up so that the user enters their name once, but then can do multiple calculations. And we did that using a while loop. And a while loop is always set up by using a Boolean expression. That is an expression that evaluates to true or false. And then it expects the Boolean expression. If it's true, it enters the while code block, which is all of this. When it reaches the end, it reevaluates that condition. And if it's true, it comes back to the top. And if it's false, it continues. The second thing we did was we accounted for bad input, that is, situations where the radius or height are less than 0, and in those situations we used an if statement to, if they're both greater than or equal to 0, we did the calculation, else we printed a message to tell the user something was invalid. I hope this video helped, and if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask.